Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah amma ba'd. Today's video is relating to a recent Telegraph interview with Robert Toombs, the famous author of The English and Their History. And a lot of what's discussed in the first half of the interview, this being part one of my commentary on the interview, raises some really fundamental questions relating to politics, Islam in modern Britain, the New Age liberal woke agenda, and so on. And so I'll get right into it. The interviewer, the Telegraph reporter, starts off the interview, and I quote, "Amidst the recurring threats posed by Islamic extremists to members of parliament, rapidly changing demographics, and the overshadowing of elections by foreign wars, can England survive as a nation?" So the thing is, I think that's unpacked in this interview, and please do check it out. The title on YouTube is Islamist Threats, Enoch Powell and the End of England, which, again, I think both the title and the introductory comments are incredibly hard-lined, dare I say, inducing fear and unnecessary tension. And we'll get onto this in one moment. I mean, can England survive as a nation? Almost certainly. It's going to take something more than a threat and the acquiescence of a threat from ultimately a weak government to tear down the entire British political and monarchical institution. I'm confident of that. Very quickly, he goes on again to ask a very pointed question. What threat does Islamic extremism pose to England? And again, I tip my hat to Robert Toombs, who has an incredibly reasonable and fair outlook on the whole situation with Islam in modern Britain, bearing in mind that he's a historian of England throughout the ages, so he has that perspective throughout centuries rather than necessarily just recent decades. And he immediately says, well, it's hard to tell. The pointed question is that, oh my goodness, there's a huge threat due to, predominantly peaceful protests by families and children sympathizing with the Palestinian struggle. God forbid we look at things, both sides of the coin. He says the real threat comes from weak policing. And I've put in my little comments here, as an extension of that, a weak government and power structure. I've mentioned it in previous videos. Are we really going to allow the country, the empire on which the sun never set, to acquiesce to demands from an extreme few? Surely not. I mean, there's this kind of comparison that's made between Islamic extremism and the Troubles, referring to Northern Ireland and the IRA terrorism. But as the good man, Mr. Robert Toombs, says, this is a completely different kettle of fish. This is not terrorism. This is mass protest, the vast majority of which is a legitimate political right done in a peaceful way. It's just the frequency and the numbers can be somewhat alarming. And to those who are now starting to realize that the ethnic minorities in this country have a real political sway, something similar, I guess, to America, where you have the Latino vote, the black vote, the minority votes really do, the gay vote, they really do have a significant sway. And so the politics does pander to these vital needs of different minority groups. And this is really the start of what we're seeing in this country. You can't expect to take in a whole load of people time and time again and not expect them to have an impact on the society. We'll get into that in a minute, because I'm in complete agreement with the essence of what Enoch Powell said back in his Rivers of Blood speech, only as so far as I don't think that sectarian and tribal politics is going to be beneficial for the prosperity of our great nation. And even though what Enoch Powell was speaking about in his Rivers of Blood speech, if you haven't listened to it before, please check it out. Type into YouTube Enoch Powell rivers of blood. Something that I came across in recent times, just to give a little footnote to that, is Enoch Powell was the second youngest university professor in Western academia. And this, I believe, was in the time of post-Second War, so relatively modern times in the last 100 years. And the only person who had a professor position at a Western university earlier than him, and I believe his was approximately 25, 26, incredibly young. Most people are doing maybe just entering postgraduate education, maybe just starting a doctorate if they're incredibly clever, not teaching the doctorate class. Anyway, the reason I mention that is because the only person to get that position before him, relating to their ages, was a certain Friedrich Nietzsche. So it just goes to show the intelligence of both Enoch Powell and Friedrich Nietzsche, very influential, intelligent figures, and the poisoning of the discussion of legitimate immigration dialogue in many ways emanates from that Rivers of Blood speech. Enoch Powell, of course, famously lost his political position due to the speech, and I think that there was a grain of truth to what he was saying, but the problem lies in the fact that when you look at that early form of immigration into Great Britain, it didn't have the impact that he said. Now, in the very recent times, in the 21st century, we've started to see that position culminate and really shoot up through the earth. So anyway, I've gone off onto Enoch Powell very quickly, but it's that real message about what the likes of Nigel Farage are talking about, the essence of what Enoch Powell was talking about, although some of what Tommy Robinson talks about, although these people generally do galvanize support from some pretty, dare I say, extremist type people, probably on the lines of using racism and nationalism in a way that can have a drop of poison. But as many may know, that the peculiar thing about heresy is that there's a portion of truth to it, and that's why people get involved, because they can see that truth. Unknowing to them, it's surrounded by misinformation and untruth. So I really liked what Robert Toombs said, is that the real problem here is not the minority Islamic extremist, although I don't like that term, because nothing about Islam, which therefore means Islamic, is extreme in my view, my understanding. If people can give examples in the comment section below, please do, because as somebody who loves to learn and grow and read, I would like to know any situations of extremism within the Aqidah, the deen, the theory and practice. Although obviously practice and theory are different things anyway. So is that the comparison to the troubles in Northern Ireland, which I found was interesting. We have not had in recent times, go back over a decade, any severe, large-scale terrorist attacks, the likes of the IRA bombing of the hotel to try and kill a large number of the government officials. So then we got on to really the crux of what is in the cultural zeitgeist currently, the war in the Holy Land and the response on the ground in this country. Robert Toombs himself said that he walked through one of the demonstrations, which I put in brackets here is a legitimate political right that some of us have started to attend, and these being some of the largest and most consistent political protests in recent history. And I can't help but think that part of the issue here is that it's a counter mainstream governmental narrative, and surely to some degree they want to diminish its impact in society. If we go back to the last time that there was this scale of demonstration, it would have been Black Lives Matter during the COVID pandemic. It would have been 2020. So you're talking just under 4 years ago, and that was wiped out pretty quickly. I say wiped out. The boil simmered down, and it was in places like London, Manchester, and other large cities in the country, and smaller cities. The demonstrations and protests took place for a day or two or three max. One day was very powerful. There was a lot of people, but like I say, its impact massively diminished and went out of the public eye for some time, whereas these have been day after day, weekend after weekend, with large numbers. And he said himself that the majority of what he saw were Muslim families with children, displaying their sympathies, of course, for the Palestinian people and their plight. So that's the main thing. The majority of this is peaceful. So let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, or, guilty by association. A very small proportion, a minority, are the hardcore attendants, the people that kind of spoil the party for everybody else and delegitimize the very real concern and legitimate right for people to stand out and utilize their freedoms in this country. He said that the second demographic he saw, though, were the Trotskyites, the Socialist Workers' Party, the white middle class, I almost want to say rebellious proportion, the people, the anti-monarchists, the anti-establishment, effectively liberal modern-day woke agenda people. And this is part of what I want to talk about and its relation to Islam in our time, the 2020s. I'll come on to that in one moment. He did mention something about his confusion as to why other exploited minorities have not been protested to the same degree, the likes of the Uyghurs in China, the issues in Burma and Iran, although he does make he has an asterisk there saying that an obvious reason would be that many of the extremists are, by definition, pro-Iranian. The freedoms there. I mean, something that come across very recently was the guy in the House of Lords who was saying, in solidarity with your sisters, a call to Muslim women to take off their hijab for 1 hour. This is an absurd comment that really shows a lack of understanding with any number of pious and believing women folk in this country. That gentleman really is out of touch with what it means to be Muslim in a real way. So that was just hilarious. But anyway, my heart goes out to people, individuals in any state, in any nation state, regardless of what religion they say they encompass and represent, for any form of marginalization or discrimination or the corrosion of any individual rights. I mean, I've just watched a great channel which I first started watching when I had just actually become Christian. My journey was one from atheism throughout my entire life. Yes, my great-grandparents were Christian due to the fact that we're English, and I went to Sunday school every now and again when I was in primary school, and yes, I sung hymns in primary school, and yes, my secondary school was Church of England, and we had a chapel and services, etc. But this is very much just part of the cultural milieu of the latter half of the the entire 20th century of this country, and it's very much in recent times becoming less and less pertinent to a national identity. But my point is that I was raised kind of very, very loosely quasi-Christian, but no serious practice, just like, say, a cultural Christian, just an Englishman of being raised in the early 21st century. So the reason I mention all that is because what is happening why did I mention that? Have I gone off on one too early? is that although I was raised with a touch of Christianity, I certainly was never Christian, and I embraced Christianity. Just before I embraced Islam, it was no more than a 6 week period between attending 6 or so Sunday services, receiving the body, what do they call it? Receiving the body and blood of Christ, a Holy Communion on Sunday. I went to a number of churches in both Manchester and just outside, in a home county just outside of the M60 in the southern part of the country. And there was a distinct lack of community. There was a distinct presence of people on the precipice of death. The parish, the communion was incredibly old, and I love to talk to these people, don't get me wrong. And I was begging to be baptized in the river. But it was very much, okay, yeah, we'll sort it out. It wasn't somebody taking me by the hand and really leading me forward. And I was finding many issues, like I say, with the sermons, things I was finding that I wanted to. I started writing my Sunday reflections based upon the Holy Communion, which is something I can pull up on my computer and actually do some videos about. But it was really the main issue was not all the periphery issues about the Church of England's acceptance and conformity to the modern way, the liberal woke agenda, for example. But more than that, it was really the foundational doctrine of Jesus being God. But I digress. When I first became Christian, and ultimately when I accepted Islam, somebody who I was watching was blogging theology, and Mr. Paul Williams, who has a vast amount of really powerful content. And again, I tip my hat to you, good sir, because his story of why I left Christianity, I resonated with that so much. I really related to it in a big way, and I can really concur with a vast majority of what the good man says. The reason I mention him is because in recent times, blogging theology, I believe it's even today on the 9th of March 2024, he released a video speaking about, and now that I don't smoke cannabis every day, which has been many years since I smoked cannabis, but I was a daily smoker for, several years. I used to be able to talk like this, but then suddenly I'd forget what I was saying. And I'd be like, damn, now my point's completely illegitimate, completely useless, because I'm just basically chatting maca, chatting, baloney. But now I remember I can keep going myself back, even though I put these footnotes in. And my point is, anybody who's listening, please subscribe. Please like the video and comment down below if any of what I'm talking about resonates with you, any queries that you have, any questions you would like answered. So remember, big up your good selves. Like, subscribe, and comment. It really makes a big difference to increase that dialogue and engagement between myself and both the Muslim and non-Muslim communities. But my point is that Paul Williams today released a video on his blogging theology channel entitled My Reflections, something along the lines of my reflections to my recent trip to Qatar. Of course, they recently held the FIFA World Cup there, with all of the madness that went around that, with the absolutely unfair Western critique on Qatar, pointing one finger over there when you got three fingers pointing back at you, of course. And the main thing that he mentioned was that even though the vast majority of the women, this is how it relates back to the freedoms or the lack of in the state of Iran, and the House, the Lord in the House of Lords, his call, I believe he was a Lord anyway, I believe he was speaking in the House of Lords, and his call to Muslim women to unite with the Iranian lasses and remove their hijab for a few hours. Wa'audu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. In Qatar, he said that the majority of women did, of course, wear hijab. In fact, a decent proportion wore niqab, which is the face covering as well. But he said there was a minority of women who did not wear the hijab. But he said that these women were not being harassed, stared at, ostracized. They had what seemed to him, their freedoms. And I think this is a really fair approach. If something that has to be enforced partly loses its legitimacy for full-grown, different for children, of course, because children need to be guided. Children need to have role models and rules to follow to live prosperous lives. Otherwise, they'll eat 10 bags of M&Ms and be sick. Do you know what I mean? They're more like animals in that way. But when you go to kind of a fully grown and matured psychological human, they really should have their choice, the power of their choice. So my heart does go out to the people in Iran and other Muslim countries where their freedoms are far more limited than what we have in the West. But out of all the Muslim countries, Iran would probably be the bottom of what I think a good Muslim country exhibits. Something like Qatar would be far closer. Somewhere like Egypt would be far closer. Now, nowhere's perfect, but I'm not really a big fan of Iran myself, to be honest. So we can all kind of agree on that one there. The other point that he raises is the blasphemy. This is the interviewer now speaking to our guy, Robert Toombs. Blasphemy laws by the back door, talking about the inability to burn the Quran in public. And Robert Toombs says, well, yes, and the thing is, you can burn as many Bibles as you like, any other religious scriptures, except this one. So I've got two comments about that. Number one, although never endorse violence or, threats, that does say something about the strength and the rigidity of the Muslims. I've used a family analogy in the past. You have all these people who, it's almost like somebody comes up and slaps their mother, slaps their wife, and they let it happen. And now their wife and their mother are susceptible to just being slapped. And that's now the new norm. And you have the Muslims who, if somebody comes and slaps your wife or slaps your mother, then you are going to get a headbutt. You are going to get tackled to the ground and you are going to get submitted, because that is absolutely unreasonable. You have transgressed the boundaries of somebody's freedom, and a protector, the mahram, the wali, the protector and the supporter of said wife or mother is going to jump on you. A man should have a peacock mentality of, somebody disrespects you and your family, somebody hurts you or your family, you're going to fight, you're going to defend. That's, again, the Islamic call to violence in a defensive situation. It is absolutely impermissible and reprehensible to slap somebody else's wife or mother. Disgusting. That's just, of course, an egregious act of violence, unnecessarily. So you don't do that. Anybody, Muslim or non-Muslim, who perpetrates those kind of actions upon people should be condemned, should be punished. But equally, if somebody does that to you, you will step and intervene. You do not turn the other. You do not, somebody comes and punches your mother, and then you turn her other cheek and allow them to punch again. What kind of man are you? I'm sorry, but this is a very reasonable approach, one that I was raised upon in a non-Muslim, relatively traditionally English family. I had roast dinners on a Sunday, went to Sunday school, watched football and rugby, grew up in the countryside. I'm a normal English dude, and when I was growing up, somebody hurts somebody you love, you step in and you say, don't do that, mate. So I'm not really understanding what the problem is with when somebody disrespects what is foundational to you, that you step up and say, that's not on. So, and in the same way, the main thing, it shouldn't be the case that somebody can burn Bibles. If somebody's burning Bibles, probably wouldn't have to go back in history too far. Potentially 100 to 150 years ago, if somebody was burning Bibles in the street, somebody come and chew your ear off, because that's absolutely disgusting. As a Muslim, I don't think Bibles should be burnt in public, because we'll get into this in a moment, but nor do I believe that Bibles should be burnt in public. Nor do I believe that the Bhagavata, let me get it up, because where's my Hindu scripture? The Gita, the Bhagavata Gita. I can't even say it, which is embarrassing. And I can't find it either. Comment down below people who here it is. The Bhagavad Gita, as it is. Something that I've not really delved into in any great depth, to be honest. An ancient text that describes how to transform one's work into yoga and provides disciplines that allow one to experience God in all things. I think that is something really powerful, to read all of the religious scriptures. I've had tasters, appetizers of it, but not really delved in. Although obviously the New Age kind of modern, what would you call it? It's new. I think it's called New. Is it New Ageism? The kind of, spiritual movement that doesn't believe in God obviously accepts meditation apps and yoga, and it's got this kind of quasi-relaxed spiritual element to it, where it actually takes in many ways a little piece of each pie of the major religions. So my point is that burning that book in public is absolutely disgusting. Burning the Vedas, is that part of the Veda? My comparative religion, I confess, is not as deep as I would like it to be. I'll get right into my response to it. In Robert Tomb's response to start with. In a traditionally British view of public order, intentionally antagonizing or provoking a certain group in society, displays that would do that do actually breach the peace of a civil society. Causing trouble by making a very clear and passive-aggressive statement like burning a holy book I don't think that's reasonable, and that's not to completely tear down the charter of free speech, but in the same way one doesn't shout fire in a cinema to cause panic and havoc when there is no fire. In a public area, you can dispute the tenets of religion. I believe that this is right or wrong, and follow Jesus rather than Muhammad, peace be upon them both. That's fine. But these very clear, provocative acts should be avoided due to just the very natural tension that will arise. It's not really from the good intention and the reasonable nature of the British people, and that's why it hasn't happened here in any deep way compared to on the European continent, where they have different issues, whether it be in the Scandinavian countries or in the Western European countries. They have different issues there, but in this country there is a distinct lack of that, and I think rightly so, because we don't really wish to stir the pot. Although I do wish people were a little bit more open than they naturally incline towards, because then we do have some better dialogue. But it should never come to the point of mad tension and passive aggressiveness. I'll move on, and we're coming to the end. That's why I've split it into two parts, because I knew that this would, didn't want the video to be hours long. He says the history of Great Britain in modern times has been fairly peaceful. Not entirely, but to a large extent. We haven't had a revolution, for example, since 1688. Obviously coming up to 350 years ago. Why? Because the British state in recent centuries has been a pretty strong institution. Robert Tombs questions, is this still the case? And I would agree with him. In the 21st century, almost seemingly, we've become, not only as a nation, but as an internal community with the political leaders heading the way. I mean, for all you want to say, good or bad, about Margaret Thatcher, she was a strong leader. Not everybody agreed with her, but she was strong. All you want to say about Winston Churchill, good or bad, you can't say he was not a strong leader. So you've got the likes of Churchill and Thatcher in British political history who are real true leaders and strong individuals, regardless of what you think about their political decisions and outlook. In recent times, have we had that? No, we've had this turnover of unelected politicians. You've got your Rishi Sunaks, you've got your Theresa May wasn't great. You've got your Liz Trusts. Boris Johnson, a good character. I like him as a caricature, but strength, not massively. I know he wrote a biography about Winston Churchill. I'm sure in many ways he wished to emulate, but you've got a Churchill and a Johnson. They're not two peas in a pod, I can say that much. When was the last time we had a strong political leader? It's a really good question. So that's something to bear in mind, and that relates to what we were speaking about earlier about the weak leadership and how to blame the ethnic minorities for being basically allowed in the country. I mean, this is crazy. In 2022, which bear in mind, in 2022, if I'm not mistaken, was it the end of lockdowns at that point? Only just. So we'd had 2020 and 2021 where we'd had in that short period of time, less than 2 years, we had 3 long lockdowns, and people to travel was incredibly difficult and not permitted. And then as soon as that lockdown stops, and COVID's basically forgotten about when the war in Ukraine started, and this is not 2022. Regardless, I'm now need to look into this in further detail. When were these people allowed in? Because God forbid that we had migrants coming into the country when the domestic citizens weren't even allowed to visit their own family. The point is, 750,000 people came into our country in 2022, which is more than 1964 to 2000. That's 36 years of combined immigration exceeded in 1 year, just 2 years ago. That doesn't seem right. Now, I'm not calling for alarmism, for racism, for unnecessary, nationalism and ostracizing minority groups, but that doesn't seem right. That does seem like, again, the classism in the country, the powers that be, could be playing pawns off against one another, because tension is naturally going to arise with these immigration figures. I think that's absolutely reasonable to say. So I am worried more about the consequences of the decisions of the people in power rather than the outcome of them being this tension created between the indigenous population and the newcomers, being foreign people settling in the country. So I'm going to end on these points, really. The danger with extremist minorities who deliberately to create division in our society and add a poison into the cultural milieu is that we are not merely talking about Islamists. And that's my issue with Islamic extremism, Islamist, is it's almost by just using the word in correlation with Islamic terrorist, Islamic extremist, I think it's a propaganda tool, because it then starts to make people not understand the vast majority of pious and practicing Muslims, what it represents, the peace and beauty that it entails. I mean, a recent example, and may Allah prevent this video from being taken down or my channel from being shut down, although that would certainly convince me that these issues are something that they do not want to be discussed. And I say they as being kind of the powers that be, like I say, the hand that moves the chess pieces beyond the political institutions that we have, that we should fight to retain, because it's really is the best of many poor situations we have. My point is that not only do I think that the elites are part of this division because of the classism that exists, but it's not merely Islamists, although that term is incredibly problematic, because the reason why I was worried about being cancelled was, to use this example, is that when Israeli children, heart-wrenchingly, disgustingly, are killed, innocent people, they're killed. But I've seen in the news that kind of the propaganda drive being that when the Palestinian children have died. So that, just for example, just the use of a word has so much impact on the way that we absorb and digest the information. If an Israeli child has been killed, but a Palestinian child has died has a more kind of neutral, natural consequence, as opposed to killed has a more kind of violent injustice imposition. of death, and that's why I don't like this. And I do like the fact that Robert Toombs says, in fairness, he says, well, the issue with extremist minorities, whether they be of Muslim heritage or from a Muslim country, but highly likely not practicing the basic tenets of Islam, and as a result, their tent, which is not pitched up appropriately, has fallen down, and they no longer represent any form of the community except from the other extremists that are out there. So my point with that is that I like that what Robert Toombs said is that we have a very real, and he said, now I want to talk about wokeness, something that we haven't spoken about much in the interview. We have a not negligible part of the young white middle class who feel alienated, who actually as a result ideologically have become radicalized. They have a renunciation of any sense of what it is to be British or Western/European, and they don't give our way of life any cultural legitimacy, and they portray the British Empire and the English history as one not of progress but responsible for degradation. And I think this is incredibly powerful, because this is why I'm the Anglo-Islamic gentleman, because I absolutely separate myself from any of these, even though they protest side to side in recognition of the struggle in the Holy Land. The Muslim families and the Trotskyites are chalk and cheese. And even though you might have the New Age wokey agenda, you know, sort of pro-feminist extremist, ideological, subversive, language manipulating group of society, what side by side, they are different groups. And the phenomenon of political extremism is one that is actually overtaking the foundation of English people in our society. I feel that the people who shout out against, for example, Islam, although not all of them, they're certainly on that side of the coin where they are very patriotic and nationalistic, as am I, which is why I completely condemn the anti-monarchists, the pro-revolutionists. No, I think that revolution is never good. Keep the status quo. That's why conservatism is ideal. So, but then this is the thing. We really need to remember that a strong sense of national solidarity is what keeps the country together. Now, you can be a Sikh Brit, a Hindu Brit, a Muslim Brit, a Catholic Brit, or a Buddhist Brit. But if you are a middle-class, white, English, anti-monarchical, anti-democratic, dare I say, because the people, there's an imposition going on here where it's not actually what the people think, it's that we're going to impose these things on you, whether you like it or not. I mean, you can just look at so many things in the workplace or just in the kind of the cultural marketplace where things are expected upon you. You have to eat up and kind of agree with what's being said, or ramifications occur. And this is the kind of sinister neo-Marxist, fascist, communist type ideology that I think the white middle class English, well-educated, relatively from wealthy backgrounds, privileged people are eating up. If they're not eating that up, they're eating up the nationalistic, traditional, but part of that often is a negation and a condemnation of Islam. So Islam in many ways in this sense is a real clear and concise middle ground which should be considered. So the abandonment of this strong sense of solidarity is not good. This is a country that's worth preserving and defending. One example he gives is Parliament. The Parliament is one of those, easy to critique, of course, but the other countries, many of the vast majority of countries in the world have not been able to create something better and to treat our monarchical, constitutional democracy and the parliamentary system as contemptible is worrying, to say the least, as Robert Toombs says, and I wholeheartedly agree. And I've just got two more comments left. That something the wokey people were engaged with was the statue destruction. You know, this kind of rewriting of history, or not accepting the facts of history, wanting to pretend that, and using that situation to condemn the history of our own nation and no longer feel aligned with it. Robert Toombs says the British Empire, he never thought that he would have a career that entailed sticking up for the British Empire, but he says that the vibe from the Trotskyites and the wokey people is one that the British Empire was not responsible for economic advancement, improvement, peace, law and order. Rather, and the creation of state institutions would have their own problem. I'm not saying the British Empire was infallible, by far, far from it, and I'm not saying that, I just think that both with Islam, with the kind of ignorant far-righty people, and the British Empire, with the wokey left-wing people, there should just be a little bit more understanding, education, and kind of a reasonable approach that the British Empire was not simply violence, slavery, exploitation, looting, and theft. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And to completely, although the new generation of people, I'm sure, see themselves as more global citizens than a particular state, they might feel that it's somewhat arbitrary to be English in the 21st century. But that has its own ramifications. So thank you so much for listening. If you watched the video this far, then I tip my hat to you, because it's just me waffling away for over 40 minutes. The main things that were spoken about really was a weak government, a weak police system, a weak power structure that has allowed a lot of these problems to arise. It's nowhere near the same extremity, but you're talking about the kind of conspiracies. Well, I say conspiracy, has it not been proven that Pearl Harbor, for example, that the Americans were aware of it happening, but they let it happen as excuse to enter the war and imposed themselves for their massive benefit? I mean, did not the European powers only stop paying off the war debt a number of years ago, certainly in the 21st century, I believe it was? And my point is that often the hands that move the chessboards, like in a game of chess, you often sacrifice pieces in order to win the bigger game. And in the same way, I fear that why was immigration at this extent allowed to happen, knowing that there will be tensions caused? That's my big question. So no doubt I agree that immigration has consequences, and I am pro strong borders, and I hope that comes across as bearing in mind that my wife's family. My wife was not born in this country, but my wife has a distinctly northwestern accent. She's a true Manc with the way she speaks, because she came here at a young age. I mean, people, where they were born, the soil on which they were born is often less important than where they were raised from the ages of 5 to 15, let's say. Those years are going to have a massive impact on the way you speak and the way you view the world. And so I think that what Douglas Murray said in the recent Talk TV interview, that this country is diverse enough. We have the people here that have come, and it's not to say to ostracize those people, it's to encourage further integration, but with a respect that that's not going to be a complete process. The respect goes both ways. Part of integration is the indigenous people realizing that those people will never be wholly indigenous, but the integration, the extent of that should be at a point where we shouldn't feel in cliques and division in society. We shouldn't have any fear-based mentality of worrying where we go, what shops we go to, people we talk to, and judgments of our lifestyle, our image, so to speak, etc., etc. So we spoke about that. We spoke about Enoch Powell. That's related to immigration. The modern day Nigel Farage would be. I think Enoch Powell was a massive inspiration to Nigel Farage, and I just think that Enoch Powell in this modern context is somebody really worth looking into and reading up on, we have the kind of the reasonable outlook that the demonstrations in Palestine, the Rochdale constituency alike, these are not wholly Muslim issues. You have actually a significant proportion, well, I say significant, a better way to put it would be a not negligible proportion of people who are engaged with these issues being white English, liberal, middle class, relatively privileged people, and ultimately a very small proportion being hardcore attendance. And so the Prime Minister's speech in recent time, his address to the nation on extremism, although it really stirred in me. It, like I say, the rhetoric was powerful because it swooped me off my feet, and I thought, as far as a speech goes, it was really powerful. It got a bit laggy at the end. It got a bit not so great, but at the start, it really enticed me in. But this whole talk of extremism is not that warranted. If, we'd had a 9/11, may Allah prevent it from happening. Let's say we had a London version of what happened in New York, then suddenly, yes, like changing laws and addresses to the country would be reasonable. But mere threats coming from people seems to me as a little bit not enough to really denote a lot of the response that is coming here. Then finally we spoke about the blasphemy laws. I'm just finishing a video. Sorry about that. Then we spoke about the blasphemy laws, and the fact that we can't burn the Quran to me is not really a key point, because we shouldn't be causing any antagonizing or provocative displays. Like, don't get me wrong, that's all subjective. Some person just talking could be provocative, and I think that we should defend one's right to speech in a public forum. But we should be mindful. What is our ultimate intention? If we have anger towards a group of people, then provoking them is less powerful than dialoguing with them. That's where I would, what's happening in Sweden, for example, the burning of the Quran in Sweden under the guise of, I have a fundamental freedom and the state needs to protect me to do this, as opposed to what you trying to do there. If you don't believe in Islam, then you're not going to become Muslim. Lakum deenakum waliya deen. Unto you your way of life, unto us our way of life. If you don't like what's happening within your culture, your society, you feel there's, like, say, in immigration, you can't just not like the fact that somebody's building a place of worship to peacefully pray and have community. You can't just be anti-mosque. Like that has a kind of far-right, nationalistic, extremist vibe to it. But you can have legitimate concerns about preserving stability and peace in your own nation. And where do you go for that? If you're in Sweden, you need to realise that there's powers that be that are, like, say, pawning you off against one another. You need to fight the system, not the result of the system being the people. So we've spoken about these kind of deeper levels to a lot of what's going on. Then talking about, alhamdulillah, the relatively peaceful 300 plus years of British history, and how we pray to Allah that this remains, but we look at really what allowed that to happen, a strong British state, and that having some very clear holes in it. The poisoning of the discussion of legitimate immigration dialogue and the rivers of blood speech that Enoch Powell presented in Birmingham, creating a very much alarmist and racist association with any kind of dialogue with integration. We're kind of thinking, he's a bit racist. But no, these can be legitimate concerns that are addressed. And I share that with the mass immigration, unlike anything we've seen in recent times. I believe in the Rivers of Blood speech, Enoch Powell speaks about 50,000 dependents, immigrants coming to the country each year. And only a few years ago, that being 750. It's a large number, almost, obviously a quarter of a million away from a million, but it's coming into 7 figures, and our country is only 8 figures. So And then finally, the danger of all extremist minorities, whether they be other religious factions or whether they be the neo-Marxist, atheistic, and Trotskyite type people, and a main call that in our country, what unites us is the Great British flag. What unites us is the monarchy. What unites us is shared traditional values. And as all those things go away, it's not the immigrants or the Muslims or even any form of extremism that is tearing that apart. It is the fabric of the people, the indigenous people, that have changed massively. If you look at the standard white English middle class or working class people of 50 years ago to now, there's been a drastic change alongside the immigration. I just think that all these points we should bear in mind. Inshallah, I'm going to do a part 2 to the video addressing the second half of the interview. It is the Telegraph interview with Robert Toombs. Any benefit of this video comes from Allah. Any mistakes and errors are entirely my own. Thanks so much for watching. I've been Anglo-Islamic Gentleman. Obviously, remember, big up your good selves.